Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Mark Winter. I'm the CEO of In Technology Distribution, and I wanted to welcome you to this webinar or this live stream. Appreciate your time in being here and being on this session. I'm going to do an introduction to Justin Fry, who's going to run through. He's going to be basically our host for today. But I would, again, just wanted to thank you from an In Technology perspective. So as I mentioned before, we are the distribution point for Bastille within Australia and New Zealand. So any questions that you have regarding the technology, feel free to come to us. But I'll pass over now to Justin, and he will carry you through the rest of the session. Thanks, Justin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Justin Fry. I'm the CMO at Bastille. Thanks for joining our webinar on wireless threat intelligence. Our speaker today is Dr. Brett Walkenhorst. Brett is the CTO at Bastille, and he's the former director of the Software-Defined Radio Lab at Georgia Tech and works closely with all our government enterprise customers. You can use the comment section in the platform to send us questions. Please send us questions. We'll answer them towards the end of the webinar, and also encourage you to send out more questions at that time. A recording of the webinar will be made available later this week, as always. So now, over to Brett.
Thanks, Justin. We're going to talk about wireless threat intelligence today. We're going to do so by first framing the problem to motivate the need for threat intel. We'll talk about the wireless problem, and then we'll talk about the solution and the different components that make up wireless threat intelligence generally. So to start, maybe just a quick definition of threat intel generally. This comprises data and analysis products that provide insight into attackers' targets, tactics, behaviors, etc. So there's a lot that goes into that, but first and foremost, what we need in order to create intelligence, particularly actionable intelligence, is we need data. And unfortunately, in the security world, data about wireless threats has been a bit sparse. There are tools and resources out there to tell us about some of the wireless threats that are available, and I'll tell you about a little bit of that at a high level today. But in general, we lack sufficient data to do this well as an entire ecosystem. And so Bastille, one of the things that we try to do is to help fill that gap. And we do so by collecting data and analyzing it by means of sensor arrays that are monitoring the wireless environment, particularly protocols including cellular, Bluetooth Classic, Bluetooth Low Energy, Wi-Fi, Zigbee, and other IoT protocols. And these sensors work together to localize those emissions. So the name of the game is detection, location, and ultimately response. We want to use the intelligence products that we generate to automate the detection of threats and to automate the response to those dependent on customer policies and use cases. So where we're headed today, again, we're going to start by motivating the problem. We'll talk about the ubiquity, invisibility, and vulnerability associated with wireless protocols. And I'll touch on some common wireless threats and vulnerabilities. We're not going to dig too deep into all that. I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of some of the threat categories or some of the more common protocols of interest. And then we'll talk about the solution. Wireless threat intelligence starts with detection and localization, enhanced by threat analysis of data, historical data, and real time, and augmented with threat research. We can provide tools to automate the detection of those threats, and through integrations with third-party software packages, automate the response in various ways. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean by that to help you kind of understand what the art of the possible is in terms of automating the response. Okay, so to start off, the wireless problem, at the foundation of this problem is, I think, an inherent misunderstanding about what constitutes our network and infrastructure. So what I like to do is illustrate this with a diagram that indicates that we have an understanding of our network assets. We know where our servers are and our clients, how they interact with one another. We have monitoring going on. And if we do this well, and that's an if there, we may not do this well. But if we do this well, we have a good understanding of the infrastructure that we have put in place, and we've done our best to mitigate risks associated with wireline and potentially Wi-Fi based threats. So that's all great, and many IT departments do a great job of that. The problem, I think, comes from a misunderstanding or lack of recognition that this network diagram is far from complete. not just because it's a silly illustration of a very small network that is not realistic, but imagine an actual network diagram with tons and tons of nodes on it. It's still incomplete because there's a lot of other stuff that comes into our space that connects to our network in some form or fashion. Through some chain, all of the devices that come in have the potential to connect to our network in some way. And this could include vendor equipment that gets installed without the knowledge of the IT department, shadow IT equipment, industrial control systems. These may or may not have the ability to even have a monitoring agent running on them. So there's limited visibility, but also limited control, limited ability to react and identify threats before they become a problem. Personal and corporate owned devices such as smartphones, peripherals, wearables, medical devices, all of this stuff may seem innocuous, but it all has the potential to come into our space through some mechanism to connect to our infrastructure. And I believe without exception, there might be some exceptions, but I think the vast majority, if not all of these kinds of devices that come in have the potential to interact with other devices through one or more wireless protocols. And it's particularly concerning when they have multiple protocols available to them. They can end up being dual homed, but they can also end up having connections that allow other devices to ultimately make their way into our corporate environment, to our corporate network. So the wireless problem is in the fact that we don't necessarily recognize that it's a problem, but it's also so widespread. There's so many of these devices that speak these wireless protocols that they rival the data transfer of wireline networks. There is so much data being pumped over these networks, cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, IoT, that it is an area of concern. So again, the network, we recognize largely that it includes Wi-Fi. And there's been a lot of attention paid to Wi-Fi within the security community, but not so much to some of these other protocols. So again, the point is that the network is bigger than we think. Then the question becomes, is wireless really a problem? So you see that there's a lot of wireless, but okay, so what? The problem in my mind is threefold. So we'll talk about each of these three things in turn. First is ubiquity. The second is invisibility. And the third is vulnerability. So by ubiquity, I mean that wireless devices are everywhere. I tried to illustrate that briefly with that high-level diagram of a network that's bigger than you think. But in general, there's tens of billions of these devices worldwide. There's a chart to the right of this, on the right side of this slide, that indicates historical and projected trends of growth of mobile devices, including cellular and IoT. So this is not all wireless, but it's a big chunk of it. And you can see that it's growing continuously, and we are in the tens of billions, rapidly approaching 100 billion. So that's just a crap ton of devices. So those numbers continue to go up. That's not changing. And the wireless signals that they emit, likewise, are everywhere. And they're impossible to control and contain. So these devices use electromagnetic waves to communicate with each other. These waves just go. There's no way to stop them from going, except under, there's certain extreme things you can do. You can build Faraday cages, which can be quite expensive. But other than that, these signals simply go, and you can't really stop them. They are similar in nature to visible light. I'll talk about that in a moment. They travel at the speed of light. But unlike visible light, they penetrate all kinds of objects, like drywall and masonry, where physical light, those materials are opaque. At these frequencies, these electromagnetic waves tend to sail right through. So the devices and their signals are everywhere, all around us, all the time, and we cannot see them. So we can see a narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum that we call the visible spectrum. And that visible light is represented in the figure on the right, upper right of this slide. You see the spectrum with small wavelengths on the left and large wavelengths on the right. If you're like me and you think of frequencies, low frequencies are on the right, high frequencies are on the left. And then there's this little tiny slice in the middle where humans are attuned to sense the electromagnetic radiation. We can see that visible light, and it's represented as a color scheme to us. And at lower frequencies, we have infrared, radio waves. Upper frequencies, we have ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. We don't see any of that. We can't see it. It's invisible. And so all of the stuff that we're talking about today, all the wireless protocols that live at those lower frequency ranges that we call radio waves, we don't see that. It's all around us. And to bring visibility to that invisible stuff requires special instrumentation. So we have electronic systems that allow us to detect, demodulate, decode this information. And that's really critical because there's important ones and zeros flying around invisibly at the speed of light all around us all the time. So we create systems like spectrum analyzers is a common example that we use that gives us a very coarse vision of what is happening in the spectrum. So I've got some plots at the bottom of this slide to indicate examples of outputs from those kinds of systems. Bottom right, I think, is the most interesting because you have a frequency time raster where frequency is like the bottom axis, time is on the left side of the plot, and power is vertical. And you can get a sense for the power distribution across the spectrum and how some of those signals are behaving. Are they always on? Are they continuous power? Do they tend to be bursty? You can get a sense of that. But that's about the limit of the analysis you can do. So it's important to bring visibility in some sense to this because it's invisible, but maybe this isn't quite enough. So we'll talk about how to bring more visibility into that in just a moment. And finally, these protocols, these wireless protocols, are vulnerable to attack. This plot shows the growth in vulnerabilities for wireless-related issues that have been published in the CVE database. You can see those numbers are growing year over year. And as with anything, this is the tip of the iceberg because we only know what we know, but there's a lot more vulnerabilities out there that might get exploited by bad actors in the form of zero-day attacks. But just the trend of growth that we see here is indicative of the problem, that the threat space is real, that these protocols are as vulnerable as wireline protocols and deserve our attention. So again, the problem is that these devices and signals are everywhere. We cannot see them, and the protocols that they utilize are vulnerable to attack. So some common threats and vulnerabilities to make that last chart a little bit more real. We'll talk about some categories for some of the different protocols. We'll start with cellular. So one common way to approach a cellular attack would be to set up a rogue cell tower. This has been done a lot over the years. Demonstrations using low-cost software-defined radio hardware enable you to capture MZs, for example. That's one common use case. But you can do a lot of different things by getting a mobile device to connect to you as their base station. And a very common approach is to do what's called a security downgrade attack. And that might be facilitated by the attacker jamming bands of cell towers nearby. If I'm an attacker, I'm not going to disrupt everybody, but I'll target like a small area and a bunch of people are going to lose service, but they'll all connect to me. And then I can force them to use a lower generation that has a lot more security vulnerabilities. 2G, for example, I just get them to connect to me and say, we're doing 2G. There's no mutual authentication. There's no way for them to verify whether I'm a legitimate base station. And I can determine the level of encryption. I basically run the show, and I can do a whole lot of things to those phones. So that's a very common attack vector. Other things, if I can get physical access to your device, I can insert malware. I can maybe have a pre-programmed payload for something that I know certain devices are vulnerable to. I plug that into your phone, and I've got a package delivered on your phone that can call back to some control center and do other things. Malicious apps have a similar trajectory. I need to get the ability to install those apps on your phone somehow. And that might be challenging, except that there's these toolkits out there, these spyware toolkits that have implemented what they call zero-click attacks, where they send a payload through some public mechanism that doesn't end up requiring any user interaction in order to install the payload. And then once that little package is installed, it calls home and downloads the full package that ultimately compromises your device completely. And with these kinds of spyware toolkits, attackers can get access to all of the data on your device, including your phone records. They can listen in on your phone calls. They can start your camera, your microphone, and surveil you while you're walking around. They can see your emails, your SMS, all of the stuff that you rely on this very fancy device for is now compromised and subject to exploitation by someone else, whoever the attacker was. There's been a lot of news on state-level spyware, particularly for Pegasus. So you may have seen some of that in the news in the last few years. It tends to get a lot of press now and then. There are several other packages of similar capability and sophistication from different companies based in different countries that are more or less regulated, and they typically are marketing to nation-state customers. So highly capable packages. But then there's a whole ecosystem of less capable but equally nefarious spyware tools that you can get, kind of like App Store level spyware capabilities. And there's a ton of that stuff out there as well. So that's a very common issue with cell phones where, again, that all that data can be compromised. And with the control and insight that they have on your phone, they can do other things as well. Typically, it's just about spying, but there are other possible trajectories they can take. For Wi-Fi, there are a number of categories that are of interest. Just by monitoring the Wi-Fi packets in an area, attackers can get a lot of interesting information. They may even be able to crack credentials based on what they sniff. They might even be able to do snooping directly if there's an open network nearby. Denial of service is a common one, but typically leads to other types of attacks. One of the most common approaches that people will take with Wi-Fi is to to set up rogue access points to do any number of things, but one of the more interesting subsets of that attack is an evil twin attack, in which we're trying to emulate a known network that a client trusts in order to get them to connect to us and then exploit that connection in some way. We can do authentication cracking using evil twins or any number of other mechanisms. Once I've got a connection with an evil twin, I can directly attack that client through a number of different tools available. And then there's a whole host of devices that I call them hacker devices. Ostensibly, they're marketed as pen testing tools, and I'm sure they're used for that legitimate purpose. But as you might know, if I can use something for pen testing, I can use it for bad purposes as well. And those tools range from the Wi-Fi USB rubber ducky, which you see depicted just to the right of the text. There's a deauth watch that's kind of cool. Wi-Fi coconut for multi-channel Wi-Fi listening and or attack. Wi-Fi pineapple, which is a really nice little device. I shouldn't say nice because it's nefarious, but it's a cool little device that you can use to instantiate an evil twin attack pretty easily. OMG cable is another one. I'm going to talk about a cousin of the OMG cable called the USB Ninja in more detail, so I won't talk about that more. But these kinds of tools are out in the wild, and they get used by bad actors. There was an example from a few years back from some Russian operatives from the GRU that were apprehended in Western Europe with a whole trunk load of equipment, including Wi-Fi surveillance and attack tools, and they were using that to surveil and attack Wi-Fi networks. They had a political reason for doing so, but anyway, they were apprehended, and that picture in the middle of the slide indicates, that story of those agents. More recently, just last year, I believe, there was some drones that were outfitted with some equipment, including a Wi-Fi pineapple, among other things. And they executed an attack on a financial firm's Wi-Fi network. They were able to crack the credentials, tunnel into the network, and started playing around with some of the internal resources. They were eventually caught, but that initial access was by Wi-Fi, and that was a really interesting delivery mechanism. And I think we're probably going to continue to see creative things like that, where people are trying to access something that they shouldn't be allowed to access. So I talked about evil twin a bit. Let me just give you an example of what this looks like to get this a little bit more specific. Again, this could be a Wi-Fi pineapple. It doesn't have to be. There are lots of tools that you can use to instantiate an evil twin. But if I create a rogue access point that claims to be an access point on a trusted network, maybe it's a corporate network or maybe it's a home network, whatever it is, I'm going to try to get a user to connect to me because they've got that network name in their preferred networks list. And so they can automatically connect to that network without any user interaction. But maybe it's an encrypted network and it's got a shared passphrase, or maybe it's an enterprise network and I'm just trying to get specific user credentials. So one thing I can do is I get that client to connect to me, and then I throw up a splash page saying something along the lines of, we're undergoing maintenance, or for whatever reason, we need to verify your identity. Please re-enter your credentials to access the network, whatever. I make it sound nice and I make it look good. There's an example from a code repo of a splash page, this green thing on the slide. That doesn't look so great, but it gives you an example of what you're trying to do. So you make this look fancy, you make it match the logo and the design of the corporation that you're trying to attack. And the user then is prompted to enter their credentials. Enter a passphrase if it's WPA personal or whatever. So the user, if they're paying attention and thinking, it smells a little fishy, I've never had to do this before, they might say, well, I'll just enter a bad password, 12345 or whatever it is. So they enter a stupid password that doesn't work. But unknown to them, the attacker has captured previously a legitimate four-way handshake, which contains hashing information that the attacker can use to check whether a clear text passphrase is the correct passphrase. So they run it through this process of hashing, and they check this MIC and as part of the four-way handshake. And if it doesn't match, they know it's the wrong password. So they do that, and they respond and say, "Good try. Thanks for playing. That's the wrong password. Please try again." And they invite the user to enter the correct password. If the user then is convinced they enter the correct password, the attacker verifies that it's the correct password. And then at that point, they have the credentials. So they can connect to the network with another RF interface, while at the same time servicing this captured client. They can maintain their position as a machine in the middle and facilitate the communication that user wants to have. Or they can drop them, and the user will end up connecting to a legitimate access point, and they're off and running. So either way, they're fine, but they've got the credentials. So that's just one simple example of how an evil twin attack could take place to do something nefarious, in this case, capturing the credentials by tricking someone into giving them. Bluetooth has a number of different vulnerabilities. There's actually a lot. And by the way, we've done several series on vulnerabilities associated with these protocols. I'm not going into much detail here, but if you're interested in learning more about that, I invite you to go to the website and check out some of those webinars that we've done previously. We've got 2 webinars on cellular vulnerabilities, 2 on Wi-Fi, 2 on Bluetooth. So go check those out if you want to dive deeper. But just at a high level, Bluetooth has a lot of vulnerabilities. One of the common things that people do with Bluetooth is similar in impact to the cellular downgrade, but this is about security downgrade with a different mechanism. Basically, I can either spoof an existing network to force security to be downgraded, or I can just try to connect and claim that I can't do certain things. And because of the ecosystem in which Bluetooth operates, interoperability is really critical. And so most developers don't put certain controls in place, and they leave things wide open so that the device that they designed is just going to connect to anybody and everybody. So if I claim that I can't do encryption, the other device says, okay, no problem. We'll talk without encryption. So it's a very simple thing to do, and it can be very powerful to downgrade security to get access to additional information that maybe you shouldn't have access to. Monitoring, similar to Wi-Fi. Denial of service, again, similar to Wi-Fi. Session hijacking, there's a lot of these kinds of attacks where I can insert myself into a session, forcing one of the devices out, so they drop the connection, but I become that device. I pretend I take that place, and then I can do other things to attack the device that I've connected to. And if I do that carefully on both sides of the connection, I can disrupt the legitimate communication, and I can serve as a machine in the middle and do additional things from that trusted position. Keystroke injection is a really interesting one. If I can convince a target that I'm a legitimate HID device, then I can provide keystrokes that target will accept. And at that point, I can do anything. I can insert malware, I can install things, I can extract information, I can run scripts, whatever it is that I want to do. So I can really take a huge amount of control at that point. There's also devices that are Bluetooth focused. In the upper right, there's an NRF device from Nordic Semiconductor, very commonly used for sniffing Bluetooth. And there's plenty of legitimate use cases for that, by the way. Developers use this kind of device all the time, but bad guys can use it too. And it can be used to attack as well as listen and do packet capture. There's a flipper device, which has gotten a lot of press recently. It's a cute little form factor, but quite capable. A lot of different protocols available to it, including Bluetooth in its native form. And there's a USB Ninja device. I mentioned the OMG cable a couple slides back. The USB Ninja is similar in nature, where we establish command and control over Bluetooth to a cable that looks just like a charging cable. You plug it into a device, that device becomes the target, and now I can execute attacks on that device. So I'll dive into a couple of these a little bit. The flipper I mentioned has gotten some press, particularly for its involvement in something called BLE spam attacks. There's a story behind this. I won't go into great detail, but the flipper wasn't the only attack tool that was used for this. It's just the one that got the most press. And the most dangerous version of this was where it would lock up an iPhone for a couple of minutes before forcing it to reboot, after which it would immediately lock up again. So it was true denial of service. And by the way, if you have an iPhone and you haven't updated for a few months, please do, because Apple did patch that so that it doesn't happen anymore. I think that might have been December or January timeframe. So consider updating your phone. Finally, the USB Ninja. I described how this works, so let me just show you a quick video to illustrate the behavior of the USB Ninja. There we go. So what you see here is the desktop of a Windows machine that this cable is plugged into. So this is the target. This is the victim. The phone that you see here has connected to the cable over Bluetooth. So this is the attacker. He's got two predefined payloads. By pushing this button, it dumps payload 1, which sends a command to the device over Bluetooth, executes and pulls up a Windows Update window. Dumping payload 2, again, executes a command over Bluetooth on the target device, which opens a web browser and points to the Bastille webpage. You can see there's nothing nefarious about this, but the point is to illustrate that we can execute any command we want, any script that we choose. We can point it to a web page, we can download some content, install malware, we can extract data. There's just tons of stuff we can do. So this is a really interesting example where wireless isn't so much the fact that wireless is vulnerable here as the fact that we're using wireless to exploit a target device in some creative way. So let's give you a sense for how we can create this wireless threat intelligence as a solution to the wireless problem. Now, this starts with wireless detection and localization. We have to have the data first, and then we can analyze that data to create our intelligence products. So how do we do that? I showed you a similar slide earlier on. This is we've got some RF sensor arrays. Again, this is the electronic device that we use to bring visibility to those invisible electromagnetic waves. So these have transceivers in them and antennas and processors, and they're very broadband, and they're constantly looking across the spectrum for these different protocols, demodulating the headers of those packets, storing the metadata from those headers, and localizing those emissions in space by sending all of their data to a server, which then figures out where in the facility that emission is coming from. So basically, we're doing detection, extracting metadata, and capturing the location information so that one view is that you can see on your floor plan at any given time where devices are, and then you can drill down into those by clicking on one of the icons to give you a richer sense of what that wireless detection indicated. So all of the fields that were captured can then be represented along with enriched data sets, including tags and whatnot. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So again, detection and location is what this is all about. The fields that we capture, there's over 100 of them across the protocols, and we capture context, connectivity, device identity, device behavior. So we have all of this information that gives us insight to kind of enrich the understanding of what's happening wirelessly. You recall that I showed you some plots from spectrum analyzers where we get a sense of power versus frequency and time. As useful as that is, it lacks the context of specific devices. It's an aggregate of the power of everything operating in a certain band integrated over some time window. In this case, we want to extract all of the information over a given time window, yes, but we're not integrating blindly. We are slicing that time window for that particular slice of spectrum into individual device emissions and extracting the metadata from the headers by decoding them. So we decode all these different protocols. Again, it's a very, very powerful RF sensor with software-defined radio technology that allows us to extract all of that, and then we store all of those fields in a database. So now we have data. We have data that indicates behavior. We have temporal, spatial dimensions as well, and we can use that data to begin to infer behaviors that might be threatening in some form. Okay, so that's what we're capturing. And again, the sensors are very capable. They're broadband. They cover the terrestrial communications bands for all these protocols, and with some very powerful FPGAs that are able to do the massively parallel demodulation and decoding that's required to be able to look across this entire spectrum and extract useful information. The sensors are further certified to work in the plenum space above ceiling tiles. That can be nice, not just for aesthetic reasons, but for operationally obscuring the fact that you have a monitoring system in place. It can be useful for operational security. The sensors are certified to be 100% RF passive. They do not transmit anything wirelessly. For one thing, we don't want to clutter the environment. We just want to listen. But we also have a lot of customers who have very strict requirements about anything transmitting in certain spaces where they want to deploy these sensors. Not all of our customers do, of course, but it's an important distinction and requirement that we have to maintain that passivity. The sensors have no moving parts. There's no fans that can make noise. There's no fans to fail and cause overheating and sensor failure. So we found this to be a very robust architecture that just works and works well. If a sensor does fail, there's monitoring actively going on all the time. So we get metrics that can lead to alerts that indicate, hey, a sensor has failed. And if a sensor does fail, we see graceful degradation in the overall system performance. What we'll find is that localization accuracy may degrade a little in the area in and around that failed sensor. But in general, we're still going to see those devices and we'll just localize them with a little bit more error. There's a lot going on under the hood of these sensors and the server applications behind them. But just to give you a couple of examples of some key differentiators for Bastille. So we've developed some IP that allows us to detect and individually locate cellular devices. And this is a very challenging thing to do, so challenging such that our other systems that do a similar function, at best, they can only really look for specific control channel packets. So a common one is a random access channel. And maybe a system can only see these ratchets, random access channel ratch. And that ratch may occur when a phone first registers on the network, when it changes towers, when it does a handoff, when a phone initiates a phone call. It does this ratching that allows it to access a traffic channel. So the base station will allocate traffic resources then. So if that's all we're looking for, then we're missing the vast majority of the traffic. So Bastille has created some IP that allows us to differentiate those, to discriminate them, and then individually locate them. And we can do this on all of the packet types, not just control packets, but data traffic as well. So the comparison is you get maybe a few dots on a map to indicate there's some phone activity here compared to a ton of activity over some period of time, like you see on the right. And this localization is very accurate for all of the protocols. We see localization accuracies on the order of 1 to 3 meters. Another key differentiator for us is this thing that we call massive multi-channel demodulation. This refers to an aspect of Bluetooth that many people may not know. But the way this works for Bluetooth Low Energy, we have 40 channels throughout our spectrum, and 3 of them are dedicated advertising channels. Now, what most sniffers will do is park on one of those advertising channels, and most devices, when they advertise, will just hop across those 3, sending the same packets and listening for responses. So if I have a sniffing device just sitting on one advertising channel, I'm probably going to see all of the advertising, but I'm not going to see anything else, because as soon as devices connect, they've discovered one another through this advertising mechanism, they connect then, they establish a process by which they're going to hop around in frequency. Now they're going to be running on the other 37 channels, and they won't be on the advertising channel at all. All their traffic is occurring on the others, and they're hopping around. So it's difficult to follow any given network. There are sniffers that can do that, but they can only follow one network. Here at Bastille, we need to see everything, and we need to be able to see all the data traffic, not just the advertising packets. So what we do, first of all, is with our very capable RF sensors, we take it all in. With the big vacuum cleaner, we just suck in the whole spectrum. And we, on the back end, then we're demodulating and decoding all of that data, and then we're disambiguating it on the back end so that we can individually locate and identify the centrals and peripherals on each individual network. So there's a lot of challenge associated with that. There's been a lot of work to build up that capability. But that's some key IP that we have that allows us to see paired Bluetooth devices. And that's critical, because if all I can see is advertising, then when Bluetooth devices actually become a threat, when there's a potential data exfiltration issue, that only occurs when they've connected. And if I can't see that, I've lost the ability to bring my detection capabilities to bear on this wireless threat. I have to be able to see these devices when they're connected. Otherwise, I've just kind of given up. So I think that's really critical. So we've done this detection, we've done localization, we've got a whole bunch of data. Now, what are we going to do with it? So we're going to analyze this data. I'll just show you some high-level examples of how we do this to give you a sense of the importance of it. And then hopefully you'll get a feel for how this threat intel plays out and the value that it provides. So we have built a number of dashboards you can get a view of. This doesn't necessarily automate a lot, but you can start to understand where these devices are, how they behave in time, space, and other metadata dimensions. So this is an example just at a very high level where over some period of time, in this case, a month's worth of time, I can look at all of the observations that the Bastille system has detected for all the different protocols. Maybe just the first thing to note here is that's a ton of observations. 18 million observations within a month. And this is not a large space. It's a typical corporate environment. And we do have people come in and we do demos and stuff, but you can see there's just a ton of observations, ton of wireless activity here. Notice that there's some spikes in certain days, maybe in the afternoons. It looks like maybe 3 consecutive days around the middle of the month, we had some extra activity going on. So you could correlate that with other information you have about the facility and try to understand if that's reasonable or if there's a spike in activity due to some other unknown event that might not be so benign. And if I look at just unique device IDs, not total observations, but those devices that have unique identifiers, I get a very different picture. In this case, you got to ask, what the heck is going on that one day where I've got this huge spike? And so we do some interesting things in our research, and there are reasons things play out the way they do in our demo center, but you see data like this, and this is an indicator that there's some digging to be done to find out why there were suddenly so many apparent unique identifying devices for Wi-Fi on one afternoon. Additional dashboards give you the ability to break down the data by protocol, by networks, by cellular carrier, IRFCAN frequency, and many other things. But let me talk about the last one here on the left, tagging. So I have the ability to annotate devices that have been detected based on certain behaviors that I observe. For example, if I know, we just hire some new person, we'll call him Joe, and Joe comes in and he's got a device and it's authorized and maybe we purchased it for him. Well, I can identify that device in the system and say, oh, this is Joe's device. Maybe that's not a good idea if you have certain policies that prevent you from identifying personal devices. But maybe there's something else you could do. Generically, you could identify it as a corporate-owned device, or you could identify it as authorized to operate in this space. Whatever it is that you choose to do, you can manually identify that. And many of our customers will do that in order to whitelist devices and say, okay, all of these devices are authorized. And then I can winnow down the set of data that I'm trying to look for because I already know when I see these devices, they're authorized. I can still be looking for other things like deviations in patterns of behavior, but in general, I can make my life a little easier by kind of offloading that stuff because I know it exists and it's going to be there a lot, and I don't have to pay attention to it so much. You can also automate the tagging of devices based on certain combinations of logical statements. So let me explain a little bit about how that works, but actually, let me jump ahead to that. So we've got some custom building blocks that enable us to automate the detection of specific behaviors. And one example of this would be geofences. So in this graphic, I'm showing a floor plan of our demo center with 6 geofences outlined as rectangles with different colors. So when something goes into that geofence, I can identify it. I can make these whatever shape I want. Rectangles are fine, but I can also create whatever crazy polygon I choose to conform to my physical structure, whatever that happens to be. And then I can create detection filters that are sequences of logic statements that allow me to identify certain complex behaviors. This is a simple one relatively, but we have developed a number of these to automate the detection of specific combinations of data. So for this, we want to say, is this device a paired Bluetooth device? I mentioned how we can see those paired devices. Now we can check certain conditions to see if what we're detecting is a paired Bluetooth device, because that might be of interest. Maybe I don't want paired Bluetooth devices in certain areas of my space, or maybe at certain times of day, or combinations of all of that. So I want to create a filter that says, if the device shows as being connected, if its protocol is Bluetooth, and if it's not using a randomized MAC, it is a Bluetooth pair. And then I can assign it a tag that will automatically get applied. In this case, it's not a Bluetooth pair, but these are all automated tags that have been applied to one device that I clicked on that brings up this additional menu that shows me all those fields that we've extracted from the header of the packet. And additional tags were applied automatically based on a number of other detection filters. So we've identified this as an unauthorized encryption scheme. It's using something that's not sufficiently secure. It's an unknown network, so that's interesting as well. And it's using a Wi-Fi direct mechanism to communicate. So that's also interesting. That gives me an enriched sense of what this device is doing. Furthermore, it was localized inside the geofence that represents the server room. So I add a tag automatically called zone server room. So this all is done all the time. You don't have to manually add these tags. You just define the logic that creates the conditions for justifying the addition of a tag, and that all happens automatically. You don't have to do anything after you've set it all up. Finally, we can set up webhooks that will allow us to send that data to some other receiving system. Just point it to a URL with a secure token if necessary, whatever. You dump all this data to some other system, and we'll talk in a minute about how we can integrate with other systems. First, let me go back to this other slide and just point out that in addition to the dashboards and things that we have available and that we're looking through with our systems and that customers can use to make sense out of things, we're also augmenting the intelligence that comes from those data products with independent threat research. That we are going out and looking at threats for different protocols, instantiating those threats, characterizing those behaviors, and then building detectors based on the research that we're doing. So this is an example of one thing that we researched and instantiated, did a bunch of packet capture and characterized how this behavior differs from normal Bluetooth behavior, where in this case, the attacker is jamming peripheral sent packets. So when the peripheral is sending a packet to the central, the attacker just steps on that packet over and over and over again until eventually the central times out, thinks that the network has just been dropped and goes away, at which point the attacker steps in, posing as the central, and hijacks the connection. So really clever little attack. Again, by instantiating and observing the behavior, we characterize it so that we can build detectors that will automate the detection of a specific threat, and then we can do something about it. And that's where these building blocks come in that would automate the tagging or annotation of specific detections, and then leading to an integration via a webhook that will allow us to automate the response. So we've come from detection and localization, characterization of behavior, threat research that leads to automatic detection of threats. Now we want to close the loop. This doesn't do us a lot of good unless we actually do something about it. We want to close the loop by taking action, by some kind of response that we automate based on customer policy, based on the threats that we see, whatever it is. We come up with a response that makes sense for this particular facility. And at Bastille, we've built a number of integrations with a lot of different tools. Just some examples include Splunk. The figure here that I showed of the webhook integration was for Splunk. That's a very common one that our customers will use. You can dump all the data to Splunk. You can have it be like an integration point for your entire SIM, SOAR architecture, whatever it is, you gather it all into one so that you can see everything there. You can do that with Bastille so that the wireless data is now augmenting the rest of your enterprise security data. We have integrations with folks like Aruba, Cisco Meraki. I'll show you an example of a network access control integration. Linnell OnGuard Secure for physical security, PagerDuty for incident response. So a lot of these integrations, there's lots of use cases that we've talked about with customers, and we can build these as we go. We're always building new ones. So let me just give you a couple of examples of videos of how this all plays out. So this is an example of an integration with video cameras where something occurs that concerns us. We have this geofenced area that we say, well, we don't want cellular devices in there. Maybe there's some secret sauce inside of this area. And this person's coming into the facility, and we see her on the camera walking through the facility, And we can also see her cell phone making its way through the facility from the entrance up towards this geofence. Now, these two cameras don't have visibility on this room, but once this device enters the geofence, we're going to send a command to these cameras to pan, tilt, and zoom to focus in on that area of interest so that we now have additional data that we can use. Maybe this helps with forensic analysis. Maybe there's legal implications here, but by capturing that data, maybe we take more comprehensive action, and we certainly have the data to know what actually happened in that area. So that's a simple example. There's another example here where we integrate with an MDM solution where someone has a phone that is migrating from this corner of the building up towards this room, which is geofenced. When the phone enters that space, you'll see a little bit of that on the camera display here. There's the room. And when it enters that space, Bastille will localize it in that room, in that geofence. It will send a webhook to the MDM system and disable the camera functionality on the phone. So simple example, maybe you've got a boardroom or some other sensitive area where you don't want, maybe people can take their phones in there, but there might be certain functions of a phone that you don't want people to be able to have. A camera seems like a simple one. So, but you can shut down anything that the MDM has control over as a result of a combination of spatial, temporal, and behavioral data that violates some policy. So that could be a simple action that you take as a response. Another example of this would be network access control. Get to the right point of the video here. Once you've set it up, then we have the same kind of scenario where this person is in one corner of the building, making his way up towards this room that has a geofence established around it. He's running a video call indicating that he's got network access. But once that device goes inside of this room, it's going to send a webhook to the network access control system that will then shut off his network access, which is indicated by his loss of the video call. So again, network access can be shut off, similar to MDM. Once that device leaves the geofence, another webhook can indicate to the NAC system that network access control can be restored, or network access can be restored. Finally, I want to show you a video of detecting an evil twin attack. So this is a specific threat that we want to be mindful of. And we're going to do this with a phone that turns on a hotspot whose SSID is copying the corporate network in this space. So he turns it on, and Bastille is going to detect that and identify it as a red icon, as in a bad thing. And it did that, and you can see it hiding behind this green R. Once it does that, it sends webhooks to Splunk, which sends me an email, and another webhook goes to PagerDuty, which sends me an SMS alert indicating an evil twin attack is going on. And you can see where that evil twin attack is in space and go do something about it. Okay, so let's recap where we've come from. We've talked about the wireless problem. There's a lot of devices out there. They send signals that are invisible, and the protocols are vulnerable. We talked about a number of examples of those vulnerabilities for different protocols, and you can dive deeper into that if you like. And the solution is wireless threat intelligence, which begins with wireless detection and localization. First, we have to have the data. We have to have the visibility into this invisible attack surface. From there, we can analyze that data, augmented with threat research, to identify bad behavior, to identify known threats, but also aberrations, things that deviate from typical baseline RF behavior. And then all of that feeds into an automated response via webhooks. So that wraps it up. I hope you found this interesting. I think this topic is fascinating, and it's really the time is right for this kind of understanding of the wireless landscape. The awareness of this has been growing in recent years, and the tools for bringing visibility to it have been maturing alongside of that. So thank you for your interest. Thanks for joining. If you found this interesting and you want to dive deeper, feel free to contact us. I mentioned the demo center a couple times. You'd be welcome to come there and see a system live. We often have people come in and just see how the system works and get training and whatnot. So feel free to engage with us, learn more. At this point, I'll turn it back to Justin, and then we'll do a brief Q&A.
Hey, Justin, you're on mute, mate.
Let's unmute myself. Thank you. So thank you so much, Brett. At this time, I'd like to invite Brad Dever and Aaron Gosney to answer some of the questions we have posed by the audience today. First of all, here's a question that we do see from time to time. What personal information does Bastille capture? Brad, you're on mute.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect.
So there's no personal identifiable information that we can gather from Bastille. The only thing that could even represent it is possibility of an SSID. If somebody's broadcasting their name in an SSID, that would be the only thing that could represent something of that person's identity. But outside of that, nothing else.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Question perhaps for Aaron here. How are the Bastille sensors connected? Is it over wireless?
No, the Bastille sensors are connected via Ethernet, and they use Power over Ethernet Plus in order to both power themselves as well as get connectivity.
Another question about one of the demonstrations that Brett showed in this webinar. The question is, does the phone have to be on the network to disable the camera? This is in reference to the MDM video.
The phone has to be reachable by the MDM software. And as long as the MDM software can communicate with the phone, then it can disable the camera on the phone.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Another question, is this an air gap system?
Yes, the system is available to be completely air gapped without any connectivity to any external systems. It also has the flexibility to be deployed to be in the private cloud as well as the public cloud.
Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. Another similar question. Where does the data live that Bastille collects?
It lives locally to the system itself by default and inside a Elasticsearch database.
Okay. Another question. Where can I use this data? Does it have an API? Can I put this in Splunk, for example?
Yes, the entire system is built on top of APIs. So you can pretty much integrate it with any system, as we showed in some of the demonstrations. That could be Splunk, could be a ServiceNow, it could be a number of systems such as the MDM or an Aruba or Cisco.
Right, excellent. Bit of an unusual question. How does it analyze if the packets are encrypted, including the header?
I'm not really sure on that one. Brad, do you have a little bit more in-depth details on that? I know we look at the header information. Normally it's specified there, and then we can extrapolate it from there, but I don't have additional details on that one.
No, not too many more additional details, but we do either analyze it for like binary if it's under-enabled, or it could be other encryption like Wi-Fi, where we do see what type of encryption level it is.
Perfect. I see some other questions coming in here. What's the maximum height we can deploy the sensor?
Normally, we would recommend it be at about the same, like 1 to 1.5 levels tall. That being said, we've had numerous areas where we've deployed them within and around auditoriums to where they have been deployed slightly farther apart and have been up as about 2.5, as far as about 2.5 stories. The only thing that you run into there is you might lose some overall accuracy just from having that height.
Okay, someone else asked, is there a wireless version of the sensor? I think we answered that question earlier.
No, there is no wireless version.
How many devices can one sensor monitor? Excellent question.
It monitors thousands of transmitter IDs at one time. We've deployed this at both testing data centers where there's been hardware testing, where there's been hundreds of thousands of transmitter IDs, as well as at trade shows within Vegas, where there's been hundreds of thousands of transmitter IDs.
Excellent, thank you. What's the typical coverage for each sensor?
So normally I don't really talk to you about the coverage of one sensor. One sensor could hear things from within a couple, within like 10 feet to hundreds of thousands of feet. It really depends on how strong the transmitter is. Normally we make recommendations on the sensor grid that we deploy. And normally when we deploy the sensors to monitor a specific area, we'll place those sensors anywhere from 30 to 40 feet apart to as far as about 100 to 120 feet apart. For most buildings, we normally place them in a grid about 60 to 80 feet apart. And that's what gives us that observations and location accuracy of 1 to 3 meters.
Excellent, good. A question that someone had submitted before the event was about Bluetooth. And how do we see Bluetooth piconets? Can we just see Bluetooth low energy or Bluetooth classic? How does that work?
So we see both Bluetooth classic and Bluetooth low energy. And that patent that we have where we monitor all the channels of Bluetooth, so I believe the 79 for Bluetooth and the 42 for Bluetooth low energy, since we're monitoring all those channels at the same time, once those devices form that pair, we watch them jumping back and forth amongst all those channels. And we can see that networking, we can continue to see those devices once they're in the pair or in that piconet.
Excellent, thank you. Another question that was submitted before the event regarding security and the Bastille data that we collect. Where does that live and how is it secured? How is it accessed? How is it protected?
So on our default deployment, we deploy everything on secure disks. So it's completely encrypted and it's deployed in a completely standalone environment.
And that's accessible over a web browser?
Yeah, everything within our system and our user interface is all by default viewed via web browser.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, that's all the questions we have today. Pretty good bunch of questions. Oh, there's one more question here. Do we have a central management monitoring for all Bastille devices that has been deployed for multiple sites?
Yes, we do. One of our larger locations has one central node and a hub and spoke formation, monitoring a total of 5 different geographic locations and multiple different buildings. And they're covering probably about 1.5 billion square feet right now.
Wow. Last question. How far apart can the sensors be placed? What's the maximum?
Once you get them to beyond a certain distance, you take the risk of potentially not seeing things that are very low energy. The farthest apart we've had them within some of our enterprises have been about 100 feet. Normally, we recommend the sweet spot is normally being about 50 to 80.
Good. Just see if anyone has any more questions before we finish this up as we come to the top of the hour. Well, as always, to learn more about Bastille, please visit bastille.net or email us at info@bastille.net or contact Mark and his team in Australia and New Zealand who could handle your inquiries locally and give you demonstrations of Bastille. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Nice. Cheer here.